Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me. Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. In a recent article in the Calcutta newspaper The Telegraph, my guest has written about what he calls the Hindu-fication of political discourse in India. He wasn't just talking about what's happened over the last 30, 40 years, but more importantly, he was referring to the way political parties today trip over themselves to Hinduize the discourse. And he also added his concern that in the weeks and months to come, the situation could worsen, if that's the right adjective, as you see the inauguration of the Ram Temple in January and national elections after that in April and May. Joining me now to discuss his views is the well-known and widely read and highly acknowledged historian and widely loved commentator, Ramachandra Guha. Ram Guha, in a recent article you've written for the Calcutta paper, The Telegraph, you write about the Hindu-fication of political discourse. And you start with a very interesting observation. You write, in the late 1980s, when the Bharatiya Janata Party was first becoming a significant force in Indian politics, the BJP leader L.K. Advani said he stood for positive secularism. And then pointedly you add, 40 years after independence, secularism was an ideal to be upheld and cherished. Now, however, no major politician of either the BJP or the Congress wishes to publicly avow secularism. Rather, they want to be known as the truest of Hindus. Can you start by explaining what has brought about this almost U-turn-like change in 4 decades?
I'll do that, Karan, but first a couple of explanatory remarks. First, this insight I owe to the Hyderabad commentator Parakala Prabhakar, who pointed out that Advani called himself a secularist, but a positive secularist. The second qualifying remark I'd like to make, which is very important, is that in the Indian context, unlike the Western context, secularism did not mean an opposition to religion. It did not mean an kind of atheistic position. It did not mean a suppression of religion. It meant a pluralistic attitude to faith, that all faiths can flourish and no faith should become dominant in the political arena. So in some ways, the Indian variety of secularism is better described as pluralism. Now, Advani was born in the 1930s. Though he was with the RSS and the BJP, he came of political age, and much of his political career was conducted at a time when the ideas of Gandhi and Nehru were dominant. And it was accepted that the Indian political ethos was secular and plural. It was not Hindu. This was not a religiously theocratic state, unlike Pakistan, which was our neighbor, or unlike some other countries around the world. And hence, secularism was a value to be affirmed, except that you could argue about how best to practice it. And Advani argued that the Congress under Rajiv Gandhi particularly, and Indira Gandhi before him, practiced a kind of pseudo-secularism where they claimed to be equal to all, but they were actually appeasing Muslims. And what he would bring about, or his party would bring about, would be, in his formulation, justice for all, appeasement for none. Now, that was, and Advani, remember, is the leader was the leader of the Ram Janmabhoomi movement. Without him and the campaign he launched, there would be no inauguration of the temple a few weeks from now. Now, in 3 decades, the whole terrain of discourse is shifted, and everyone wants to be known as more Hindu. Mr. Rahul Gandhi says the RSS practices spurious Hinduism, mine is the real Hinduism. So it's a kind of mirror image, exactly the opposite of what Advani was doing. So it's a sign of the growing Hindu-fication of political discourse. That's a factual observation. Added to that is my analytical understanding that this may reshape Indian politics and Indian public life in directions we cannot anticipate and which may actually be quite negative.
But Ram, it's not just a change in acceptable discourse and ideology that's taken place. It's also a change in how political parties deliberately, consciously, and purposefully present themselves. You write, and I'm quoting you, once BJP leaders wish to be known as better secularists than their opponents in the Congress. Now Congress leaders wish to be known as more devout Hindus than their opponents in the BJP. And as you alluded a moment ago, Rahul Gandhi has begun to proclaim himself as a Shiv Bhakt and a Janodhari Hindu. Would you agree that whilst the BJP has got away with the shift, or at least people have accepted it, in Congress's case, the shift has led the party to stumble?
Yes, and I think also to perhaps to electoral defeat. But if you look at the recent elections, state elections that were conducted, in Chhattisgarh and Rajasthan, beg your pardon, Chhattisgarh and Madhya Pradesh particularly, the Congress candidates for chief minister presented themselves in an overtly Hindu idiom. I mean, Baghel talked about pilgrimage circuits. Kamal Nath talked about being a great Hanuman Bhakt. And clearly, it's a game you can't beat the BJP at. It's also a game that runs counter to the whole history of Congress pluralism, the tradition of people like Nehru and Gandhi, whom I've already mentioned. But somehow they feel, and I think it's instrumental. I don't think that, Baghel and Kamal Nath are doing it out of deep devotion, deep concern, a deep understanding and respect for the Hindu faith and its nuances. They think they have to do it because the population has become religious majoritarian. They think that this is a and they're not completely wrong in this. I think it's important for all of us to recognize, particularly for opponents of Hindutva like myself, to recognize that there has been a shift in the popular consciousness, particularly in northern India, much less in southern India. But in northern India, the propaganda, the ideology, the efforts, the organizational, momentum of the BJP and the RSS has persuaded many people in the cities and in the countryside, many Hindus, that this is the Hindu country and the Hindu essence, the so-called Hindu essence must be brought in the forefront. We must not be embarrassed about it. We must own it as a Hindu country. And Muslims and Christians and Sikhs and Parsis must accept it. They must live as, under our dominance.
You're absolutely right when you say that the Hindu-fication of political discourse is infinitely greater in the north than it is in the south. But you point out in that Telegraph article that signs of it emerging in the south have already now become noticeable. You point out that H.D. Kumaraswamy in Karnataka has started ending his speeches with the phrase Jai Shri Ram. And K. Kavita of the BRS has publicly said that the Ram temple fulfills the dreams of crores of Hindus. So under the influence of the BJP, or under the belief that this is going to appeal to Hindus across the country, whether they're in the north or the south, this is starting to spread southwards as well. Slowly, perhaps, but it is starting.
Well, yes, but also, I think these are particular cases. Mr. Kumaraswamy and Ms. Kavita want to ally with the BJP. Kumaraswamy has already formalized an alliance. His party, JDS, has formalized an alliance. Hence, for the first, as a subordinate partner to the BJP. So the BJP will set the terms of the alliance. And just as a servant tries to please the master by flattering him, Kumaraswamy now thinks he has to say Jai Shri Ram, which he never before said in his 3-decade-long political career, to appease, and I use the word advisedly, appease the bosses of the BJP so that they would give him more Lok Sabha seats in Karnataka than might otherwise be the case. Likewise with Kavita, after the BRS's humiliating defeat, unexpected defeat in the state elections in Telangana, it's very likely that they will arrive at the BJP. There is an element of popular support for Hindutva in the south, but it's substantially less than the north. And I think it's what Kumaraswamy and Kavita have done is like Baghel and Baghel and Kamal Nath, use a Hindu idiom tactically, instrumentally. In the case of Baghel and Kamal Nath, to ingratiate themselves with the electorate of Chhattisgarh and Madhya Pradesh, respectively. But in the case of Kumaraswamy and Kavita, it's being done to ingratiate themselves with their bosses in the BJP.
As you said, a lot of this is opportunism. It's being said and done not because people are convinced that it matters, not because they believe it personally, but because they believe it will work with the electorate. Do you believe that this Hindu-fication of political discourse is going to both enhance and proliferate as we see the inauguration of the Ram Temple, which is now literally just 31, 32 days away? And then again, when we face the national elections and the campaigning gets underway, particularly in the months of April and May?
I think that's certainly the intention of the BJP. I mean, the fact that the inauguration was planned just 3 months before the election, the fact that the Prime Minister will be present, we do not know yet in what role. Will it be in a super dominant role as it was in the parliament or in the foundation ceremonies of the Ram Temple? We don't know. It's clear that this is not accidental. The inauguration was planned to coincide with the onset of campaigning for the elections. It will lead to a greater emphasis on Hindutva ideology and politics. It will lead to an even more exaggerated presentation of India as a Hindu country above all, in which minorities have to live at the mercy of the Hindus. So I think all this is going to happen. Now, we don't know. So that's very clear. All this will happen from the side of the BJP. An intensification of Hindu first discourse, Hindu dominant discourse. How will the India Alliance react? One can't say. I mean, I'm not privy to how they will behave, whether they will mimic this. And as I suggest in my article, it's whether some enthusiastic congressman will say the credit should go to Rajiv Gandhi because he opened the locks of the side. We'll have to see.
Absolutely. Let's talk at this moment a little specifically about the Ram Temple. You make a very interesting contrast in your Telegraph article between the Babri Masjid and how it was viewed, and between the Ram Temple and how it's perceived today. You say, and I'm quoting you, the Babri Masjid was a symbol of religious and military conquest. The new temple will be a symbol of religious triumphalism, a sign that this is becoming ever more a Hindu-first country. The state's involvement in the Ram Temple project is a further reinforcement of the idea that India is above all a Hindu country. Will the Ram Temple, therefore, with its inauguration and with the crowds and the millions, maybe hundreds of millions who keep visiting, have a significant change in the nature of our politics, and perhaps even more importantly, a significant change in the self-identity of our country?
We have to wait and see. But first, a couple of, again, qualifications. The Babri Masjid was constructed in the 16th century. So it was a symbol of military and religious triumphalism, consistent with the mores of the medieval period. The Ram Temple is being constructed in the 21st century. It's a symbol of religious and indeed political triumphalism, inconsistent with constitutional values. I think that's very, very important to underline. When the masjid was demolished, there were various, in my view, quite honorable and creative alternatives offered. Someone said, given the enormous loss of life that had preceded, the demolition of the masjid and all the riots and all in India, which we may talk about, some people said, there should be a hospital there for the poor. Others said there could be a children's park. Yet others said, I think this was a proposal of the late philosopher Ramachandra Gandhi, that there should be a Ram Rahim Darwaza, symbolizing peace and harmony and fraternity between Hindus and Muslims. Now, all those, in my view, quite admirable suggestions were rejected in favor of a temple. For, shall we say, the victorious and the triumphant side, And again, the choice was, what do? You have a small shrine, you make it a public spectacle, you call thousands of people, including, as we are now seeing, the richest industrialists, the most famous film stars, etc. Do you telecast it to all of India? Or do you do it, because you see, Karan, this is an important point one must make. What the BJP and Hindutva are doing is reshaping the nature of Hinduism. Hinduism is not a congregational faith. You know, it's not, we do not have a holy text like the Bible. We do not have a holy city like Mecca. We don't all have to congregate in our thousands to show how devout we are. Hinduism has been historically a disaggregated, decentralized faith, which people can worship in their homes, in their puja room, in the local temple, to a local god, to a village deity, to a family deity. Now, this is an attempt to make a consolidated Hinduism for the political benefit of the BJP. Now, just as an aside, after I wrote my article, the Prime Minister inaugurated, he loves inaugurating large monuments and large buildings. I mean, he loves that. He went to his constituency, Varanasi, and inaugurated something called, I think, a Svarved Mahamandir, a meditation center for 20,000 people. Now, just think of this. Now, just think of the colossal money that was spent and how else it could have been used. But meditation is private. You meditate in a cave or in the forest. You don't meditate 20,000 people together. It's also a sign of authoritarianism. One leader will tell you how to meditate, what to chant, which God to worship, how precisely to worship it, what verse to recite, what verse not to recite. Now, this is a profoundly radical reshaping of Hinduism in a way which has never been attempted in its millennia-long history. And I think it's very disturbing. It's also, as I said, again, to emphasize, the Babri Masjid, the construction, unappealing as it was consistent with the mores of the 16th century. The Ram temple and its spectacle and its monumentalism is absolutely inconsistent with the constitutional ethos of a democratic and plural India.
And the interesting thing you made about that meditation center that the Prime Minister inaugurated in Varanasi is that it represents, if I can use that phrase, the congregationalization of the Hindu faith, something that is alien to Hinduism, but is typical of and essential to both Islam and Christianity. It is another way in which our faith is becoming much more akin to the Abrahamic faith rather than to the Hindu core that was originally rooted in.
Absolutely. I mean, as Ashish Nandi would say, radical Islam is Hindutva's intimate enemy.
Absolutely. Now, you're absolutely right in saying we don't know what will be the impact of the Ram temple when it gets inaugurated on the 22nd of January, or the impact of the forthcoming elections, which will happen in another 4 or 5 months, both on the nature of Indian politics and the self-identity of India as a country. But something else is very apparent about the Ram temple. It's going to be the biggest, grandest monument to Ram ever built in India. That is the clear expressed intention of the BJP. And that is very different, as I noticed, to the Church of the Nativity, which is the birthplace of Jesus in Bethlehem. Nothing is likely to outshine the Ram temple in India, but the Bethlehem church is a small and architecturally unimpressive compared to, say, St. Peter's in the Vatican, to the Hagia Sophia in Old Constantinople, and indeed even to the bizarre cathedral built in Yamoussoukro in faraway Cote d'Ivoire. Those are huge monumental pieces, but this will be even grander and very different to the Church of the Nativity where Jesus was born. So that's another contrast, isn't it? Jesus' place is small, inconspicuous, and hardly noticeable. The Ram temple will be very different.
Yeah, I mean, of course, it's possibly, one shouldn't read too much into it. If the whole of the Middle East, if the Christians had, shall we say, won the Crusades and consolidated comprehensively and consolidated the whole of the Middle East under their control and killed every last Muslim and Jew they may have built a similar kind of monument too. I mean, we can't say that. I mean, the fact is, Jerusalem was, contested and so on. So, but this is a monument to triumphalism. It's also, it kind of, it's counter, in a sense, counter to the Hindu faith, because the Hindu faith does not require a huge monument to worship. I also mentioned Gandhi, and we can talk about that. Gandhi's Ram was within him. He didn't in a temple. I mean, it could be a small shrine. I talk about my mother and my mother-in-law in the small shrines they worshipped in. So it's also to show it's actually to show the world and effectively show Indian minorities. By the way, I should say something. After I wrote that piece in the Telegraph, I got some moving wails, not just from Muslims, but from Sikhs and Christians, because they too are worried about majoritarianism. They too are worried about angry young men brandishing Trishul, shouting Jai Shri Ram. I mean, they feel vulnerable too, So, and Muslims, of course, would most of all, given the whole complex and contested history of our subcontinent. So, what does this mean in the 21st century in a pluralistic democracy? Was this really needed? Is it exhibitionism? Is it vanity? Is it megalomania? Is it majoritarian hubris? Is perhaps all of the above?
In fact, you're making a very important point. The Ram Temple is not so much a monument to faith and to spirituality and to worship, but an indication and a sign of triumphalism, and may I add, the might of Hinduism, the supremacy of Hinduism.
Supremacy, exactly. It's a monument to supremacism. That's what it is.
Now, in your Telegraph article, you also detect the emergence of monarchical overtones in the way the Prime Minister is addressed and discussed in connection with the Ram Temple, but not just the Ram Temple, also in connection with other temples that he's inaugurated in Varanasi, his constituency. You say, and I'm quoting you, with the Prime Minister playing a leading part in the rituals accompanying both the first and final rites of the Ayodhya edifice, there is a decidedly monarchical cast to the proceedings. This was also perhaps even more apparent in December 2021 in Varanasi, when the priests actually chanted Raja Sahib ki Jai. Of course, this may be democratically repugnant, but would you accept that it accords with the culture, the thinking, the history, and the Maharaja Maharani worship that many Indian people feel for centuries?
But to some extent, yes. I mean, you're right that there is a history of worshipping kings. I mean, the Maharana of Udaipur claimed to be descended from the sun god. In Teri Garhwal, which is where I kind of grew up, the king was known as Bolanda Badrinath, speaking Badrinath, because Badrinath was traditionally under his territory. But it's kind of repugnant to a democratic ethos. And the most remarkable, bizarre example of Mr. Modi's monarchical ambitions and forms of presentation was the inauguration of the Parliament Karan. This was supposed to represent, 800, 900 MPs, Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha combined, about 800, slightly less than 800 MPs, representing 1 billion plus citizens. And thus there was this Shahinshah alone, flanked by supplicatory priests. Now, it's really bizarre and creepy. And it's clearly, it's not just counter to the democratic ethos. It's all about himself. I mean, he doesn't have children, so who will he pass it on to? It's not like the Maharana of Udaipur, adopting a nephew and making him the next Maharana and saying, he is the descendant of the sun god after me. Now, so it's like, I mean, I think we should all take pause. We should all take pause. It could be, as Ambedkar so wisely warned in his last speech to the Constituent Assembly. He may, among the warnings, among the very sage and wise and perceptive remarks he made was, first, one that is very well known, which is that bhakti in religion is a route to the salvation of the soul. Bhakti in politics is a route to dictatorship, right? Which, of course, anticipated Indira Gandhi and now perhaps Narendra Modi. But also he said, and I think that's something all Indian Democrats should ponder about, he said, could it be that democracy is merely a top dressing on Indian soil? So I think we have tried strenuously over 75 years to, of course, have elections, but democracy is much more than elections, to create a democratic ethos And all this sets back our efforts a great deal.
Let's at this point, Ram, broaden our discussion. There are other countries in our neighborhood which have also followed a majoritarian path, by no means dissimilar to the one that we're steadily and swiftly walking down ourselves. I'm talking of Pakistan and Sri Lanka, they're prime examples, but Bangladesh could arguably be a third as well. What does their experience teach us as a lesson that we should be well aware of?
So, Karan, I often, for many years, I have warned, and I have not been alone in this warning, that India should learn from the tale of Pakistan. What happens when faith dominates? What deeply negative and corrosive impact it has on your economy, your society, your political ethos, the lives of ordinary citizens. But probably a more salient and relevant cautionary tale is that of Sri Lanka, because Pakistan was extremely feudal. Women have been oppressed historically well before the Taliban or Islamic fundamentalism, before Zia-ul Haq. It had a very feudal and backward agrarian system. It had no industry, no entrepreneurship. India's example is somewhat akin to Sri Lanka. If you look at Sri Lanka, it had an educated professional class. It had very high rates of literacy, a low infant mortality, excellent indicators, health, education, fabulous destination for tourists, with its ancient sites as well as its coasts. And then the Civil War happened. Why did the Civil War happen? Because the Sinhala speaking and Buddhist faith affirming majority said, we must put the Tamils, who are largely Hindus, in their place. Right. And they imposed their language Sinhala and their faith Buddhism on the whole of the island. If that civil war had not happened, I am convinced that Sri Lanka would become one other Southeast Asian tiger. It would have had the levels of high standards of living and a free society of the kind that South Korea and Taiwan now enjoy. It may even have been the case that the software boom that has occurred in my hometown, Bangalore, could have happened in Sri Lanka because of their high levels of education, because of their high degree of gender equality. So that is really the cautionary example you should think about. One other example, which comes to mind, is that of Iran. Now, women were really emancipated in the Iran of the 1970s. You will remember that. Now, the Shah was an authoritarian, but the alternatives to the Shah was not only Ayatollah Khomeini. There was a democratic liberal opposition to the Shah, which you will remember, Karan.
Shahpur Bakhtiyar.
Exactly. Shahpur Bakhtiyar, Mehdi Bazargan, all those people. Right. Now, once the Ayatollahs took over, the women were put behind parda, dissent was crushed, the universities were suppressed, and the economic and social creativity of the people of Iran was, just nullified by one autocratic regime. So here are some of, the idea that Hindus can never be majoritarian. Hindus are different. It's not at all true. We're already seeing the impact. It's surely not a coincidence that the southern states, where religious bigotry is much less, are far more advanced than some of the northern states where religious bigotry is more heightened. And likewise with the position of women. So I think we should all take pause. And I'll say one last thing, Karan. How a society moves, how popular culture is shaped, is often determined to a substantial extent by the political leadership. So when Gandhi was the leader of the Hindus, he said, untouchability is bad. The oppression of women is bad. We dislike British colonialism, but we don't dislike the British people. We'll even imbibe the best values from the West and their friendship. Now, Gandhi stoked, shall we say, the better instincts of Hindus. The best instinct, not just Gandhi, other reformers like Nehru, Ambedkar, Ram Mohan Roy, Phule, you can add a whole list. Now, what these people are doing, our current rulers are doing, is bringing out the fearful, angry, paranoid side of Hinduism. And I think that should worry all of us.
In fact,
but of course, not just Hindus.
In fact, you make a very different but very telling comparison between the sort of country India is becoming and the successful countries of Asia, countries such as Japan, Singapore, and South Korea. You say, and once again, I'm quoting you, in all three countries, the presence of religion in politics and public life is extremely muted. In India, it's loud and getting louder, and it's becoming enforced almost by the government through its rhetoric on a daily basis. That is a very sharp and telling contrast. We want to be like Singapore, like Japan, like South Korea, but the role and the dominance of religion in our life suggests we're being very different in our behavior.
So all thinking Indians, all Indians who care about the future of our society should look at the one side at what Japan, South Korea, and Singapore have done with religious faith in public life. And on the other hand, at what Sri Lanka, Pakistan, and Bangladesh have done. I mean, the choices are very clear.
Absolutely. Finally, and to be honest, Ram, I've left this deliberately to the end. Let's talk about your personal attitude to the Ram Temple. Because the Ram Temple and the sort of impact it could have on our politics and our self-identity is at the core of this interview today. You say, and I'm quoting you, as a Hindu myself, I cannot bring myself to celebrate this new temple. And you cite two reasons for that. Let's take those one by one. First, you say you've lived in North India during those bloody years when the masjid was destroyed and thousands of innocent people, mostly Muslims, lost their lives in frenzied rioting. Can you explain that point further?
So I lived in North India from 1988 to 1994. And this was a time when the Ayodhya movement was at its most intense, its most active, its most, passionate. And it spawned a series of riots all across northern and western India. It polarized, as you know, families, communities, villages. And I visited Bhagalpur after the 1989 riots. And that was, I think it remains the most troubling and traumatic experience of my whole life. And I've had others too. I mean, I've been in, Bastar in the midst of the civil war between Naxalites and the Indian state, and all, and between the kind of insurgency and the suppression by the state. And I've seen tribal squeezed by both sides and all the suffering and so on. But that was really troubling and traumatic. And the slogans during that, the rioters, who were wanted. The people who wanted the Ram temple built and young men, angry young men, were going around looking for Muslims to attack, shouting, Pakistan ya Kabristan. That was the slogan of that time. You run away to Pakistan, or off with your heads. We will kill you. We will send you to the graveyard. Now, this is the background to it. Now, it mystifies me how the Supreme Court could reward, the party that had led to this bloodshed and mayhem, not just the destruction of a particular structure. I mean, I don't mourn that structure. That's eminently unmournable, the Babri Masjid. But the thousands of lives lost, the hundreds of thousands of people displaced, families wrecked, poison, suspicion, hatred, communal antagonism in the minds of millions of people, tens of millions of people across northern and western India. And what will this do to, reconcile any of that? So I can't see it. I mean, I can't welcome it, frankly.
Your second reason why you do not celebrate the inauguration and the building of the Ram temple is a lot more to do with the way you view your faith. Once again, I'm going to quote you. You say, I do not believe that to affirm or proclaim my faith, I must do so in front of or inside a colossal edifice costing thousands of crores of rupees to build. I take it this is both a spiritual and an aesthetic concern. Am I right?
I think it's mostly spiritual. I mean, I wouldn't call it aesthetic per se. I think it's mostly spiritual. I mean, I think faith is a personal thing. I don't quote it in this article, but it comes not just from growing up in the family I did, but also from being a lifelong student of Gandhi and his ways. And Gandhi was deeply religious. He was a Hindu, and the name of Ram, as I say in my article, was in his mouth and his lips and in his heart, including when he was murdered, right? And he didn't need a temple. And there's a lovely story of a Christian disciple of Gandhi, Verrier Elvin, who was a priest, who was kicked out by his bishop because he did not believe in converting the tribals. He said, I'm a Christian myself, but I won't convert the tribals. And he was kicked out by the church, and Gandhi wrote him the most moving consolatory letter where he said, your church is the earth, your altar is the open sky. You do not need any structure to, be one with divinity. And so in that sense, aesthetic, I can't say. What will, for example, from an aesthetic point of view, there is a question. We go and visit the Brihadishwara temple 1,000 years later for its beauty, for its architectural beauty. You don't have to be a Hindu. Will people be going to this temple 1,000 years later? One can't say. I won't be around. My descendants won't be around. But it's more a spiritual, and dare I say it, a democratic concern that this is not the country, this does not represent the country that the makers of our constitution, that the leaders of our freedom struggle wish to build.
My last question, and let me point out, I am not deliberately not asking you to be clairvoyant, I'm asking you to be analytical. Do you think the inauguration of the Ram Temple could be a turning point in the politics of our country?
See, it's very hard to say, Karan, and because its history is full of unexpected twists and turns. And will it lead to Hinduism becoming more congregational? Will it lead to every Hindu all over India rushing to Ayodhya? Will it lead them to abandon their small local gods and their village deities? What will happen to the political project of Hindutva embodied by Modi, Shah and the BJP, in the long term? Neither of them are like you and me, they are not immortal. So it's very hard to predict. But in the present, I can say that the whole tamasha around the Ram temple is, I think, should worry Indian citizens who believe in democracy and pluralism. I've already told you that it's not just the Muslims, Sikhs and Christians are worried too, and I'm worried as a Hindu. I wish it was muted. I wish the Prime Minister was not going. I wish the richest, they could have had their temple and, they could have designed it as they wished. I wish that, Adani and Ambani and Amitabh Bachchan and etc. were not, it had to be this kind of spectacular show. What is this show? What is this desire to make it so extravagant, so triumphalist? What does this demonstrate? It demonstrates a kind of supremacy, an attempt to enforce a religious majoritarian supremacy over a diverse and pluralistic land.
I think that's a very important last sentence. I'll repeat it for the sake of the audience, and I think I'm quoting you verbatim when I say it. The tamasha around the Ram temple, the tamasha around the Ram temple should worry every Indian citizen who believes in democracy and pluralism. This is becoming a symbol of supremacy. Ram Guha, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Karan.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch The Interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.